Chapter 2 Leviathan 2 The hatch popped open with a hiss as I helped Jenny out of the boat and down the ladder. Dan was waiting for us on a platform off of the dock, occupying himself with the air pressure controls. We were about to enter a long vertical tube that reached far below 40 meters. This will deposit us back into our homes and labs. The captain sped away without a farewell, and we found ourselves alone on the tower surrounded by steely, chopping waves. Beetle black eyes watched the orange needle on the pressure gauge drop into a zone deemed suitable by a neon green backdrop. Jenny's sterling silver eyes fixed upon the clouds above us, and I found myself looking down to the depths of the sea, wondering what sort of dinner plate Lydia had waiting for me there. The hatch opened, and Dan stepped onto the ladder, entering the first tube of many that comprised our home. Jenny was next. She had no more fear of the height or the dark, as she had been living in the labyrinth with us for almost a year now. Thunder clapped aloud above us and echoed in the passage like a drum. I heaved the heavy metal latch shut and felt my ears pop as the auto pump began to change the pressure around us. For this reason, we had to descend slowly and stop off at platforms every 15 meters to keep our heads from swimming and our white knuckles from letting go of the rails. There were a total of 3 platforms, and at each of these stops, Charles had provided artwork from a private collection. It was Charles who built this place. He founded the resort on the island and breathed life into the glass that forms the underwater passages and rooms we call home. The first platform, like all the others, had a small cove we could walk into after we stepped off the ladder. There were refreshments as well as a single chair, and the wall across from it had a painting with a scenario or landscape from above. 3 could stand comfortably abreast in these circular rooms without danger of being crowded or falling off the edge. Nonetheless, Dan kept a tight grip on one of Jenny's shoulders whenever we stopped at one of these enclaves. Being deaf and mute never impaired her senses of spacing or balance, but it did install a kind of overprotectiveness in Daniel. Based on the strained look I saw in Jenny's eyes, Daniel's grip on her was beginning to cause some embarrassment. Now that Jenny was older and more aware of the world beyond the water, her tolerance for being treated like a fragile doll was beginning to wear thin. Each passing inverted sunset we never saw seemed to steal away some part of the internal peace which each of us kept locked away beneath the waves. With raising a family and balancing responsibilities that came with being in charge of the subnautical teams, Dan had created his own ways and religiously kept to them. The rest of us had long since let him keep to his own. I was worried about Anne, though. His wife of 13 years had begun to fear the slowly increasing outbursts of childish rage. These fits were distressing to those who had the misfortune of living with him. I saw Jenny's hazy eyes glaze listlessly at the painting on the first platform. There was a farm which had 3 horses cresting a hill mid-gallop. Jenny loved these paintings with animals. On the second platform, there was a painting of a ship. Its magnificent purple sails flew above a school of flying fish mid-leap. It was spectacular, really, but after seeing it so many times for a year, it had begun to lose its grandeur. The final platform was lit with an all-consuming red light, where an orange painting of 2 maneless male lions looked off into a gray savanna with faces of contentment and curiosity. In my eyes, they looked like kittens ready to play after a nap. The bottom of the pipe had a door which you could open, but it only led to another which you could not, as it was locked from the other side. There was nothing to do but wait. All 3 of us sat down on a plastic bench, while the pressure adjusted to its own calculations. It always took 15 minutes too long, in my opinion. Dan always took the lead in these types of precautions. The other members of our underwater crew always led him, knowing full well he had the most to lose to an accident. I daydreamed of a faraway life in Kenya, taking pictures, not unlike the 2 maneless male lions hung on the walls above us. It seemed like forever ago, and it was all a dream, maybe. Something was dreamlike about it. Perhaps it was the quality that was because it was a place I could never return to, or it was dreamlike in that it was a place it could not be escaped from until woken up. Air squealed like a tire being topped off, and the door swung wide to the smell of chicken and sweet vinegar. Dr. Ann Lamb came in with a whoop and hugged her daughter with a joyous noise. Anne was cresting 40, and when she hugged the neck of her daughter, her wrinkles ran out from her eyes in charming crow's feet that told wild tales of a happy life. Whenever she smiled, and that was often, Her whole soul became an aurora borealis that shimmered with both wisdom and kindness. We moved along the passage towards the main part of the station. I tagged along behind them until they stopped in front of the first great viewing passage of Window A. They were a nativity of silhouettes overcast upon the twilight backdrop of the deep. Each character leveled off at a different height so that Jenny seemed to live amongst the stalks of pale corals, whilst Anne's head was nestled above Jenny's in the green streamers of seaweed. Finally, to complete the image, Dan's height left him isolated above them. This was the view that I had inside the glass tube that looked out upon the seafloor. The view outside was only broken by a metal grate below which you could walk on, and a metal ceiling which ran pipes down the corridor and held some soft lighting. The lambs looked out for a moment at the coral mound on which Leviathan 2 was anchored. The reef that we were on top of was also the one I was in caretaker of. The corals were white, ghostly pale, and crumbling into a gray-green slime, starting with the ones closest to our station. For me, this image represented my failure to impress change on mankind for their conscious and unconscious actions. Anne looked at Jenny and signed something below her waist in figures neither I nor Dan could have seen. These silent words, whatever they may have been, made Jenny and Anne giggle in a sly way. Anne set her girl down and turned to me. "You have something. Just here." She lifted her tiny fingers to my brow and plucked off a fish scale wet with pink slime. "Thanks." "Yeah, I couldn't take you seriously with that." She giggled. Anne asked the question that was burning in my mind. "What's for supper?" "Chicken, with salad." Anne turned to Jenny and quickly signed what was for dinner. Jenny signed with a rub of her belly. A flash of bushy brown hair sped off down the turquoise tunnel. "I'm not all that hungry," I remarked. "Scared you with the evac button, did I?" said Dan. "It's not that," I said quickly, glancing out the window at the Ceratopia glistening in the icicles dangling from a winter gutter. It doesn't matter anymore," I finished. "No, go on, Timothy." Dan leaned forward. "Tim will tell us when he's good and ready. Right, Tim?" Anne pushed lightly on Dan's chest. I knew the opposite of Dan's words were the truth, but I didn't dare to say anything. Instead, I casually stated, "I think I'm going to go on a run before lunch. Work up an appetite, you know." Anne interjected, "Actually, Tim, you have a visitor. Charles is joining us for lunch and wanted to talk to you beforehand." I couldn't help but release a sigh. I had longed for a moment of quietness and solitude, a thing hard to find when one lives in a confined space with 8 others. "Charles is here." "Well, this is good news. I hope he has given more thought to my research paper on the heat sink solution. It's not cheap, but our tests in the labs have been the most promising results of all my work." I knew I was beaming. "Well, he's in the observatory, waiting for you now." I plastered a smile on my face to hide my disappointment. The observatory is the largest room here at Leviathan 2, a resting area and my favorite spot to sit for some peace. I found the seaweed that drew near the windows relaxing and therapeutic to watch. Occasionally some life presented itself to you if you were patient. The observatory was a bower below the waves. You could always hear your own heart beating past your eardrums since the pressure was so tight in Leviathan 2. The walls were too close together for most people, but I reveled in the fact that only 2 meters of glass separated you from the wide expanse of the underwater world, which opened up into white rays cascading into an endless abyss. When I entered the room, there was a stoic figure standing with his hands behind his back. Charles was gripping his Rolex watch tensely, his ancient frame radiating power. He was freshly haberdashed in a cornflower blue silken shirt. Above the room, hanging limply from the ceiling with its nose tilted downward, was a model of an ancient toothed whale, the namesake of our research station, and a bit of a depressing figure. Models of fossils possessed my imagination whenever I encountered them. I hesitated to engage Charles by gazing upon the soft blue couch in the center of the observatory. My meandering thoughts returned to Charles's silhouette when he noticed my presence without turning from the glass and began to speak to me. "There is no life interested in our little project, is there, Dr. Mason?" Charles had a habit of calling his endeavors little projects. This amused me as he was the richest man I had ever heard of. His most successful operations were a series of hospitals and resorts, but I heard that he had other gainful endeavors not so publicly mentioned. I felt myself feeling the same infantile spasms of nervousness I recognized from the first day I sat across him in one of his grand high-ceiling resorts. The same day he gave me this job. Those same overtones of forebodance and willpower, manifested by the husky voice of a middle-aged man, rang out to me today as clearly as they did 1 year ago. It's not just here. Leviathan 1 is suffering too. People demand the ferry to come sooner than the scheduled 3-day interval so that they can leave this resort. Guests sit at tables below the waves for days and see nothing. The reviews are in and our ratings are down. These are bad times for everyone, everywhere. The elite are tightening their belts. I cannot continue to sustain the work of this research station in its entirety. I don't feel anyone is to blame personally. I just can't see a future for this reef anymore. All your preservation concepts simply aren't as viable as your optimism makes them out to be. The challenges all marine life is facing right now can't be countered by one man's wealth. There's rising temperatures, overfishing population, and an ever-expanding population of people to deal with, Tim. It's just too much for one little research station to make a hill of beans difference about. Charles paused to shift his hulking frame from one leg onto another. Then he asked me directly, "How large did you say your current coral nursery has grown?" "I have one that's grown up to 7 centimeters in radius. It takes an awfully long time for them to grow, Charles. They aren't a crop we can just fertilize after all." You said a while back that some species of corals have astounding medical properties that could prove valuable to my hospitals as anti-inflammatories and potential cancer treatments. Why haven't I seen anything from you on that subject? I could justify a bigger budget if you provided a wider range of resources. I need a lot more time before our reef is healthy enough to bounce back from any kind of harvest, Charles. I haven't concerned myself with those particular species. I'm currently working with genetic hybrids, only of the most hardy species. Once I've demonstrated generic success, I have every intention of diversifying and producing a more profitable range of resources. After a year under the waves, I had hoped for more from you personally, but such is the way of sciences, I suppose. The station is understaffed as is, one specialist per need, and in the end it comes off as a gimmick to my peers. Without the profit from this resort, I'll have to shut my Leviathan Science Division down entirely. Those profits are far, far under projections for this year's tourist season. It has come to my attention that to remove one of your team members from the staff of this lower station would be like removing the wrong piece from a Jenga tower. I should have stopped funding this little $400 million project a long time ago. Can you think of any solutions for me here, Tim? For the crashed economy, I have no solutions. Economics was taught in another building. Charles turned away from the glass and let his dark hair drape over his hanged head. He appeared uncharacteristically melancholy and looked older than his 50 years. I took this moment to run wild with a rant I had practiced several times in front of my bathroom mirror. Charles, there's no life in this view because there's no food for them to eat. There's no food to eat because there are no places for the fish to hide. Here, the coral reefs are 80% bleached and 20% dead. They're bleached because of the symbiotic algae they need to draw their energy from. Lately, have become too hot and are producing the wrong chemicals from the disturbed reaction speed. They're producing peroxide and bleach instead of sugars. The reef is not coming back, Charles. At this point in a few years, none of the reefs will be coming back. These guys have to repair themselves, find new symbiotes, and fight off infections all within a very short time. Unfortunately, the temperatures of the oceans are only going to continue to rise from now. From a financial standpoint, say you lose profits for 4, maybe 5 years, and you will lose profits, Charles. You're going to have to dump a lot of money into the solution, but in the end, your tourists will come back, if only for the sad reason that this may be the last reef left on the planet. It pains me to say this, but But only then will you be able to make prompt money off our work, my work. But it's important, Charles. I'm on the edge of fixing a global problem from a one-room apartment on the bottom of the ocean. If it works, by the end of my life, coral reefs will be permanently on life support, but they'll be coming back globally. In an attempt to look less desperately at Charles, I directed my gaze over his shoulder and out the window. Tim, I have reviewed your essay. It's inventive, if not a little childish, to believe something like these machines could cool the immediate waters and incubate live reefs in an open ocean environment. However, my problem with the concept is far more basic. There would be an incredible drain on our resources. Refrigerating the ocean at even a few degrees less locally would take more power than the geothermal resources we already use for this. It would not be wise to push limits for our power supply whilst living in glass tubing. We could lose life support down here if we tried it now. The vents and lights would shut off, and where would I be then but responsible for the largest underwater research disaster since the Belford diving incident? That's not a position I want to find myself in. Do you? I'm not great at owning mistakes, especially the mistakes of others. Lastly, in case the reasons I have already given aren't enough to change your mind, the resources we require the largest quantity of would also drain the fastest. Of course, you know I'm speaking from a financial standpoint here, Tim. It can be done. You would need to harvest the energy from the sun and the corals as the plants do, put up wind turbines and work the tide. It's all here. It can be done. It should be done. I placed my hand on the cool, smooth silk cloth of his shoulder. Don't you want to be the man who saved the last great coral reef in the world? He did not look at me. He didn't even flinch at this appeal. Calmly and coldly, he said, I cannot justify that enormous mechanical overhaul of this station without higher profits from this resort. I'm sorry, and I know you're not going to appreciate this, but I have another idea on the subject of your specialization. Tim, your research is suspended until the resort's profits return to a comfortable minimum. I anticipate that as a naturally growing entity, the hybrid corals currently developing on the seafloor will continue to thrive without your oversight. In the meantime, don't worry about creating new hybrids for any purpose, profit or otherwise. I'm bringing in a temporary aquarium design specialist to lead us in a more aesthetically pleasing direction for the moment. Call it an emergency course of correction, until the time that we can resume working together to accomplish your audacious vision of a better tomorrow. Blood flowed past my eardrums with the spirit of a thundering horse. I stared blankly at my salad as Lydia poured on balsamic vinaigrette. I heard nothing but the sizzle of my heartstrings as I thought over the changes weighing down on me like the claustrophobic walls which encased me. I allowed myself to wonder if 5 or so years ago I had stayed in the safety of the mosquito netting, stayed there in the warm, sweet-smelling evenings at the Kenyan and Ugandan rail sides. There, my days were full and rich with doing valuable journalistic work on other conservation efforts. Electric nights spent kissing Tessa's nose ring and fooling around by the light of the small battery lamp above our bed. And Dr. Tim Mason will be overseeing these changes? I snapped back into consciousness at the steel-pressed dinner table and found myself staring at a drowned chicken lying grotesquely in a bed of leaves. That doesn't sound like something Tim would approve of. Paul was speaking and rubbing his fingers through his white alpine hair, squinting his baby face into a look of confusion as best he could. His complexion was pink, and I always felt it was more than living so far away from the sun that did this to him. Paul was a hard man to read, not because of any complex skill or internal fortitude, but because Paul's face simply lacked the excess of skin needed to show sincerity of any kind. Paul's place below the waves here was a sort of backup ichthyologist. Where Daniel's domain extended among the incredibly large area of bony fishes, Paul's research sometimes overlapped with Dan's animals, such as jellyfish, sea slugs, cephalopods, and sea anemones. However, they were firmly under Paul's responsibilities. Below the table, I could faintly hear the crackle of wrapping paper unfurling as someone tried to stealthily consume a candy. I looked about, happy to amuse myself over this meaningless distraction. Paul maintained manners in all circumstances except in the presence of Candy. Charles glanced coldly at Paul and then at me. I felt the marionette strings tighten. I responded mechanically by lacing my fingers together tight and leaning in towards the crew, and I said, "We will be using synthetic coral decorums, lures, and regular baitings of krill, shrimp, and fish bits at several times of the day to lure in wildlife in front of the viewing window stations of Leviathan 1's Atlantis resort to boost the station's entertainment value. Our research on alternative methods of reviving bleached corals will be suspended for this season." My lips quivered for a moment before I focused on stealing back my nerves. Anne's shining soul looked at me as if she did not know me. She squeezed Jenny's shoulders. Paul tried to express confusion on his tight pink face, and Dan crossed his fingers while continuing to chew his dinner. Charles relaxed his prehistoric frame, taking in our reactions while he leaned back in his chair. My colleagues and friends finally understood what Charles was implying underneath my robotic words. There was so much I wanted to say to them. I hoped they could see it in my face as they all looked at me in shock. I longed for Charles to leave the room so I could speak from my heart. Charles seized this moment to set a new tone with a few more exciting words. To help oversee these adjustments, I'm having a new team member join the station. She will be arriving at 11 tomorrow morning on the ferry with the necessary equipment I have requested her to direct you all in installing. Her name is Claire Clark, a 24-year-old woman with a recent graduate of Drexel's engineering program. Her credentials in the field, with her past internship, I think she will bring a new idea to our little team and help us stay current with what's happening in the younger generation. I trust she will enjoy her time under the waves with all of you. Paul lifted his chin. Anne caught my eyes remotely, and I stole mine away quickly. Dan was looking at me. I looked at Juan, who was busy eating the last of the green leaves his wife had prepared for us. Juan had the gray features of one whose circumstances in life had left more marks on them than their just age. He was 45, but he could still move like a kid on a soccer field who carries a neighborhood game to victory in the rain and the mud. "Don't you feel the least bit bad about this? Dropping months of experimentation and growth on these new corals? I'll be damned." It was Mac who spoke, and Mac who was now shaking his head. He didn't understand people, so Mac often fronted as a nightmare pretending to be a person. He was looking at me crossways out of his melon-shaped glasses. I studied the lines on his face. Mac looked frayed at the edges and split like the seams on a well-loved dirty yellow baseball that had been hit way too many times. He was a former Navy man. His sole duty was in the upkeep of our fragile glass house. As I scrutinized him, he continued, When you do talk, it's all about nothing but this global warming bullshit. About the corals taking 10 years or so to recover from a single bleaching, and now it's just dick after dick coming down from them. Now you're planning on just up and leaving your research for an unknown amount of time. What does that even mean? Throw out all these corals you've been torturing, freezing, firing lasers at, and taking pictures of? Eric slapped the hat off of Mac's head, and Mac slapped Eric in the groin. I didn't like Eric very much. It was never that he was a bothersome person or too much like Mac. It had been more to do with the fact that he was a very boring person. If personality is a successful series of gestures, then Eric was without true personality. He enjoyed sports and not much else. Eric and I had nothing in common, and despite my best efforts, Eric had never tried to reach out to me. To get to know me, I avoided him. Some of my teammates suspected that I had an overt hatred of him. It wasn't that at all, though I never cared to defend or refute this opinion. I simply didn't care to put forth any more effort into the thought of Eric at all. Charles grinned malevolently at the sudden violence for the slightest half moment before a habit of composure and restraint brought about an appropriate measure of displeasure over his face. Based off of this change in expression, as well as his past experiences I had with Charles, I knew something dark lurked in his soul. At the sight of blood or a fight, Charles's blood boiled. He had a passion for a good fight. Even minor squabbles satisfied this twisted nerve. I felt that should a genuine fight break out between Eric and Mac, Charles may even stand to tear his shirt and howl at the full moon far above in the invisible sky. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Paul move his head slightly sideways to sneakily slip a brown caramel cream into his mouth and chew it greedily, apparently unappeased by the turmoil and conflict unfolding right in front of him. Anne stepped gingerly into the conversation in order to restore some balance to the tumultuous dinner table. "How's Navajo today, Dan?" Navajo Joe didn't show. Dan was studying a piece of chicken he was rotating on a fork lazily. He filled his mouth with it in order to avoid further forceful insertion into this conversation. Charles took the lead to speak once again. "Anne, when did you last see your dolphin pod?" 21 days ago. We tracked Miami close to our area and hired the captain to follow them around for a bit. Jenny got to feed Pinky, Scout, and Pacific Blue. Miami was cryo-aggressive, and for that reason I believe 2 of the females to be pregnant." Jenny began to move her hands into symbols, and by doing so announced to all that Mom got to swim with the dolphins. Jose leaned forward to whisper this to Charles. "Oh, that's wonderful. I know your mother is undisputably the best diver on this team. Wouldn't you pass it along to Jenny, Daniel?" Charles did not wait for Dan to complete his signs before he asked Anne, "Did you use a tank or did you free dive again?" Anne blushed. I did a little free diving, just reminding myself what I can do. I wasn't testing my limits again." Anne smiled out of the side of her face, trying to keep a modest hand on her obvious pride. "She frightens me every time she does it," Dan said. "Come now, Anne is in no danger," Charles assured. Paul popped another caramel cream into his mouth brazenly. Anne's face fell down and she observed her chicken dish dispassionately. Paul piped up. "What's the deal with these salads? When did it become a fad to consider a salad an actual meal?" Lydia crossed her arms over her large bosom and opened her mouth ready to retort. Anne stepped in to defend the vegetation. "It's good for you. It has a lot of vitamins. You don't get it in an average meal. It takes more energy to stab this hunk of lettuce with my fork and bring it to my mouth to chew and swallow this lettuce than it will give me upon digestion. Now that I can't ignore. It's a failure of a food," he mumbled. Paul felt witty and important, and so he ended his statement with one finger down on the table. "So, by that same standard, a caramel cream or, say, a saltwater taffy doesn't add any overt nutrients to your life? Would you say candy is also a failure of a food?" Her voice rose slightly in that "I'm right and you should feel irked" sort of way some possessed. Besides this, Paul had a weakness for caramel creams and saltwater taffies, and everyone knew it, so naturally he was cut to the core that she had called him out on eating them just now. "It's a sugar. Nothing produces energy like sugars. If anything, caramel creams light the way for other foods." He shrugged his shoulders as he said that. Jenny choked on bites of chicken and leaves. Anne turned her attention back to her loved ones and slapped Jenny on the back as the girl recovered her airway. Seeing Jenny's sterling silver eyes made Anne's heart swell with an aurora borealis of maternal pride. She signed free and light motions to her little girl. "Jenny, dear, you finished your food early. Would you mind playing for Charles and us while we eat? Maybe the last thing you learned, but only the first 3 movements. Or 2 movements. Isn't that Beethoven, love?" Jenny responded through her hands and her eyes shone with unspoken words. "Oh, my new song. Let me go get my violin." In a flash of bushy brown hair, Jenny had run out the kitchen door and returned with her violin. Standing with perfectly prim posture, she placed the instrument under her chin and stood by the door. All the seats moved with metallic creaks and scrapes to properly view the entertainment. Jenny looked as if she was balancing something delicate on her chin, and at any moment it might fall. When she touched the resin to the bow to chorus music into the room, I shut my eyes to see old evenings in sunlit lawns far away by my mother's creek. Magpies called to me in memories by way of the vibrations of the strings as Beethoven transcended the distance between the hearts all present at the table. Jenny waved her hand as lightly as a butterfly flaps its wings. Melody, most beautiful and bright, ran in circles around the lights above. Her persistence in violin captivated us all as I thought of her obstacle. I felt connected to the strings as my hands turned cold as ice. The music transported me to a place of joy. Notes like sunlit pollen floated upwards. It was as if the music had placed before me a glimmer of the Library of Alexandria. It was only a year ago when she first picked up her violin. Only 6 months ago did we insist she practice in a room with the door shut. Jenny scratched a note and her cheek flushed white. Her eyes locked with her mother's too, moistened in anticipation of a rebuke. Anne nodded genially and prompted her to continue. Jenny relaxed and placed the note into the proper frame of time pleasantly. She brought down the last note softly into silence and stillness. The quiet was broken with thunderous applause. Juan stood abruptly, sending his metal chair flying into the black wall. Charles stood next, and soon we were all standing. Jenny's cheeks were embossed red. Her mother motioned a bow that Jenny followed in mirroring. After the recital, Jenny put away her brown violin, and we returned to our meals with renewed souls and a sense of cheerfulness my day did not warrant. Charles lifted a delicately carved piece of chicken into his mouth. After a few bites in which he scanned the room for a new point of conversation, he turned to Lydia, who sat as close as she could get to the corner, quietly nibbling her food like a little brown mouse. "Lydia, how are your 28 days of R&R? I heard you went to Buenos Aires." Lydia talked rhythmically about a month of life with her family, and Charles nodded his head with understanding, though I imagined he was not truly listening. "Wonderful skiing there, the mountains ablaze with purple light in the evening." He leaned back in his chair, imagining the vista. "It was nice. I only wish my husband would have gone with me," Lydia said somewhat pointedly. We all understood what she meant, and remembered that when Charles told us he had refused to allow both Lydia and Juan to go back home. I lifted a piece of toast to my eye and pulled out a black tube of what some might take for soy sauce in an icing container. "Disgusting," sighed Jenny, making a face at my Australian condiment. I sighed. "What, you don't want some on your chicken?" I pushed the tube out towards her, and she recoiled, remembering the last time I let her sample some of this new foreign spread. "That stuff's nasty," Eric exclaimed, furthering my distaste for him. Charles agreed, adding, "Yeast's a hell of a thing to take 'em raw like that." He pulled out his phone and tapped on the screen a few times. After looking very intently at the device for a few seconds, he glanced over at Anne and said, "You know, Anne, this new kind of lure will likely have a negative effect on the dolphin population, and I wanted you to hear it from me." Lydia sat in the corner with all the nervous energy of a tea kettle on high heat. Anne took a deep breath and visibly calmed herself before fixing Charles with a cold stare. "So what you mean to tell me is that this lure will either push the animals out of their environment or cause them to become prey to larger predators?" Charles opened his mouth to interject, but Anne cut him off. "Charles, this is unethical. This goes against everything we've worked towards. She motioned to me and the rest of the table. "Some of these animals are endangered. Their survival is absolutely necessary. This stunt threatens the reef's health quite dramatically." She shook her head. For the majority of the conversation, Jenny had been clinging to her mom's arm, but as it got more heated, I began to notice signs of anger and distress on her small face. When Anne mentioned the animals, she took a break to calm herself by signing the highlights to Jenny, who then clenched her fist and frowned at Charles. The old man heaved a big sigh and placatingly opened his palms to Anne. I don't know what you want me to say, Anne. I'm sorry you feel this way, but you won't even have the resources or funding to do any of this research in the future unless I make this sacrifice. Here and now, the funding has to come from somewhere. Lydia rocked back and forth on her hands, making sounds, looking for a place to interject into the conversation. Dan was now looking positively worried and kept trying to calm Anne down. Paul continued to nervously pop his candies into his mouth while Mac was looking overly interested in his dinner plate. The whole room was a mess of tensions. Jenny had begun to frantically pull on Anne's sleeve and was signing something so quickly it had become unintelligible to me. I could only make out the words please and friends. Anne allowed Dan to rub circles in her back and returned to Jenny. What is it, dear? She sighed. Jenny repeated her message, and Annie looked at her sadly. I'm doing what I can, sweetie. Dan looked concerned when Anne began to wipe silent tears from Jenny's cheek. Anne, what's wrong? What's wrong with Jenny? Without turning away from her daughter, Annie replied in a small voice thick with emotion. She wants to save her friends. She's worried about what will happen to them. Anne began to drop tears from her cheeks. The awkwardness in the air was so thick I almost choked on it, and no one spoke for what felt like forever. Finally, Lydia had gummed up all of the courage necessary from her nervous movements and noise-making to say aloud to Charles, Charles, can we have some kind of talk about those of us who are a family here being able to leave on holiday together? I can only spare one teamer at a time. You know this, Lydia. Tim, isn't your R&R coming up next? Charles quickly switched the subject of conversation. It is, I said quietly enough to let Lydia interject. She never did. It was uncomfortably quiet for a moment until I thought of something else to say. I think I'll try something more remote this time. Maybe Peru? The countryside? It was an unwise move to have said that, but I was still on the edge. I know a thing or two about Peru, Charles leaned in. Yeah, didn't you own an oil rig or two there? He stopped chewing. Maybe I still do. No, I heard those towns dried up, along with the oil rig. He smiled wryly. I knew about an incident 10 or so years ago in the jungle there, but I held my tongue from all the gory details. My co-workers would be affronted, and Charles would have me removed should I say any more. My eyes met his, and memories of perhaps this one and only defeat silently attacked his soul for my own amusement. Oil towns are like that. They come in with the rig, and they should leave with the rig. That's where I almost died from being attacked by a native, Tim. I had a wife there, too, in Peru, for a time. Charles's voice quivered as the conversation approached territories unknown to the rest of us. I sat forward expecting some grand tale and an unleashing of only the most secret passions. Charles fumbled with the little black buttons on his silken shirt and had soon uncovered his left shoulder to reveal a series of triangular gashes covered over by multiple surgeries. There, where Christ dust on the cross, was an honest-to-God spear wound to the ribs. After staring at his wounds a few moments longer, Charles rebuttoned his shirt and stood to address us all. Thank God Central America houses some of the best plastic surgeons in the world. My face. He grazed his chin on the black stubble that grew unevenly there. My face I got back more or less, but these scars I kept. I lost something unbelievably unique to me there. I'll never forget it. And I can't erase these wounds inside or out. Tim, enjoy Peru. In the meantime, I have a demonstration for one of your new techniques. I've had a man use your Bathysphere to place something over the top of us just now. I've gotten the signal that a show is about to start, and I'd like you all to follow me into the observatory for just a quick moment. Turning to Dan and Anne, he said, Please don't forget about Jenny. She's not going to want to miss this. He smiled at the girl, and she squirmed in her seat. As I sat, I breathed in the familiar scent of recycled oxygen. I looked longingly up at the ancient whale overhead. Charles stepped over to a small control panel on the left side of the wall. It came with an antiquated-looking monitor and arcade-style control scheme. His hands fumbled with the joystick for a moment. Our tiny spherical craft was operable without the need to be piloted from within. There was a man sitting inside the craft now. He probably was, and Charles always liked to be in charge and run things on his own schedule. My musings were interrupted by the sight of something beside the whale skull looking down from us above. It appeared at the top of the glass, almost fully obstructed from view by the bones of the fossil. As I studied the object, I realized it was a bulbous mass of white flesh, slowly floating down from beyond the fossil and bumping into the glass. It rolled unevenly and trailed red ribbons behind in the water. Paul squinted his eyes as best as he could to look out into the abyss. Eric leaned against the wall and began to look about inside the room to avoid vomiting as the gore passed his head. Mac placed a hand on the glass, and Juan tried to manage his heavy breathing. In a radical display of nerve, Paul called out to the raptured crowd, I fail to see the relevance of this. This isn't anything we haven't tried before. Dan was using bait just this evening on the boat. This side of the Mando, the ocean is dead. Paul shook his head. Charles said nothing. Jenny stepped forward. A doll hung limply from her hand. The doll's hair was red yarn, and its fishtail was covered in cheap reflexive green confetti. The blubbery ball of bait landed below the glass. Dust and rock moved in hazy rings away from the carcass's impact with the ground. We could now see the face of a dead cetacean, its eyes white, glassy, and rolled back. Deep cuts, like the stripes from a tiger's mauling, ran along its back and head, with the mechanical precision to the spacing of the slash marks. Charles put a hand on the glass. Our anticipation added one more atmosphere of pressure to the five in the room. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shadow loomed out from the deep blue of distance. It was an arrow in form gliding toward us. He was every bit as graceful as he was massive. He made a quarter turn and revealed his sleek, angular form. Our eyes bulged as we looked out at the dorsal fin's tag hanging there as if some oversized fly fisherman had just lost his lure. He jerked sideways, allowing us to see the deep scar behind his pectoral fin, and we knew that this was Navajo Joe. Once more, in my mind, I heard violin strings swelling as the hulking carnivore descended to our level. He swam up to the glass. I shivered at the sight of his 4-meter-long, rough-skinned, tombstone gray body. The shark bumped his sensitive nose into the observatory as he dove down and slid his two-toned lips back over his horridly thin, crimson-pink gums. This act revealed 5 rows of razor-sharp, triangular teeth. I was reminded that one white shark can have up to 3,000 teeth as the crimson-pink jaw clutched clumsily at the white flesh. His eyes rolled backwards like an old doll's eyes. The mermaid dropped from Jenny's hand, and we said nothing until Charles did. So far, you've only chummed these waters. But this animal is stuffed with a new kind of lure. The Chinese were using it as a chemical, as an additive to body spray. Powerful stuff, too. Didn't take long before it was recalled in all the coastal areas around China. I have 10 55-gallon drums of it arriving at Leviathan 1 tomorrow. He turned to me with lightning bolts inside his piercing blue eyes. Would you kindly see to it that we slowly release this lure under Poseidon's palace? He turned back to the glass and said more to himself than to anyone people want a show. He is a show. Bones crunched audibly and sent shockwaves across the ends and edges of all my nerves. The magnificently deadly and endlessly beautiful Navajo Joe finished off his bite and swam back out into obscurity, leaving only the cetacean's severed tail upon the sands. Once the shadow of the shark had faded like ink dribbled into a pond, one by one we recollected our constitutions. I pondered the unknown negative implications of the use of this new chemical lure. Perhaps it would have a similar effect to sunscreen. Who could tell? But I knew beyond any chain of command that it was my duty to test it first and find out what effect. Beyond the dramatic effect it might have on everyone down here, I ran this train of thought around the summit of my troubled mind as we exited the dome. We moved out in silence the same way as the order of processions at a funeral. Charles made himself up to leave the research station, and we filed ourselves away into our own corners and individual enterprises, all except Jenny, who did not even stoop to pick up her fallen doll.